All right. Well, then I will turn it over to Josh to introduce today's program.
Yes. So today we are fortunate to be joined by Kevin Barton. Kevin Barton is the District Attorney for Washington County. He was elected to office in May 2018. The Washington County DA's office consists of over 130 employees whose mission is to seek justice and protect our community. Prior to becoming District Attorney, Mr. Barton served as a career prosecutor in the Washington County DA's office, where he prosecuted a variety of crimes, including murder, child abuse, assault, domestic violence, fraud, and theft. Mr. Barton is a member of a number of charitable and nonprofit boards, including CARES Northwest, Washington County Family Justice Center, the Oregon Department of Justice's Child Abuse Multidisciplinary Intervention Advisory Council, that one's a mouthful, Safe Neighborhoods for Oregon, and the Oregon District Attorneys Association. Before becoming a prosecutor, Mr. Barton was a trial attorney in the Portland's office of Bullivant, Hauser, and Bailey, PC, a West Coast law firm. During that time, he represented businesses and people involved in civil litigation. Mr. Barton attended Gonzaga University and the University of Notre Dame Law School. He was raised locally in the Portland metropolitan area and has lived in Oregon for over 30 years. If you can please join me in welcoming District Attorney Kevin Barton.
Thank you. Good to see you all. I spoke before you over a year ago now, before COVID, and to me, anything before COVID just seems like so long ago. But I do remember it. I remember it very well being at Pacific, and it's really nice to be back in front of you all here today. So thank you for inviting me. I believe you also had one of my deputy DAs, Allison Brown, come speak to you at some point in the last year. She oversees our vulnerable adults prosecution unit. Sometimes people call that elder abuse. So you've heard twice from us before, and good for you for being willing to go back into it and have us come back a third time. So thank you. Before I talk about DA's office issues, I want to talk about something more important. March Madness. I heard you mention that early in the conversation, and of course I have to put a plug in for my Zags. So here's a nickel's worth of free advice. Pick Gonzaga to go all the way. I do every year, and I'm confident this is the year. So I wanted to say that. I do have a PowerPoint. It's very brief, and I just thought it would be a nice way to shape our conversation, but I'm not wedded to it. I'm going to see if I can share my screen here, and I can. So hopefully you are all now seeing my PowerPoint. Can someone give me a thumbs up? Okay. I'm not savvy enough to have it play as a slideshow, so we're going to kind of do it just like this, but this is really just to shape the conversation. So before I get into too much of this, I want to tell you more about me. As you heard from my bio, that's all the professional stuff, but maybe the more important thing is I live in Sherwood with my wife and my 3 kids. I am struggling. We are struggling with Zoom school like every other parent that I talk to. My kids are in 2nd, 4th, and 6th grade, and we're just trying to balance life in 2021, like I'm assuming all of you are as well. I worked from home, a rare instance the other day, and I realized that my son was doing 6th grade in the dining room. One daughter was doing 2nd grade in one of our kind of den areas, and the other one was doing 4th grade at the kitchen table. So my work from home ended up with me in the garage on meetings. So I decided I'm far more useful if I'm in the office. Before I get into too much about our office, I thought I'd share with you a story, because the nice thing about the work that we do is we interact with so many people in our community, and it's really just so many stories, many of them tragic, some of them hopeful. This one has a little bit of both, but it's emblematic of the work that we do. Not long ago, about a month ago, one of our prosecutors, actually it was Allison Brown, the woman who spoke to you all about the vulnerable adults initiative that we have. Allison was in trial, and it was a child sex trafficking case. So that involved a pimp who was literally prostituting or pimping out a teenage girl. and he was caught in a sting operation by the Beaverton Police Department. And we not only he was arrested, but he was prosecuted and he asserted his right to a trial. So we had a trial. And during COVID, we have continued to operate in a modified way, like many of you have. But part of that is giving people their right to their day in court. And that's important, not only for people who are accused of crimes to have a day in court, but also for our community, for our victims who are enduring that trauma because they've been victimized by a crime, or witnesses who may have witnessed a crime happen, and just the community as a whole to be able to move forward. So like so many other cases during COVID, this one proceeded forward to a trial. I'm happy to report that the pimp was convicted of the sex trafficking and everything worked the way we hoped it would. The uplifting part about it is after the trial, Allison was approached, and the person who approached her was an expert witness, a computer expert who had been hired by the defense. And he approached her and said he felt so moved by what he had seen during the trial, and he felt so personally obligated to do something to help, even though he had been hired by the defense, the person accused of the crime. He wanted to take all the money he had earned from that case, from the defense, and donate it to a charity of the victim's choosing. And the victim, when she was asked what would she like to do with this, she picked a place called Safety Compass, which is a local nonprofit that works in Washington, Marion, and Clackamas counties to help out victims and survivors of sex trafficking. So it's overall a tragic story because of the reason we were there, but with a little bit of hope mixed in with the idea that people tried to do something good out of something bad. And I thought I would just start by sharing that with you because I do think it's emblematic of what we try and do in our office. So our mission, as you heard, is seeking justice and protecting our community. It's a relatively straightforward mission. And what that means is the seeking justice part is always doing the right thing for the right reason. And the protecting our community part is remembering that every decision we make has a connection, has a strong nexus to making sure our community, our Washington County community is safe. As you probably all know, the DA is responsible for prosecuting laws within Washington County, wherever those crimes might occur. And every year, we do quite a bit of that work. This next slide just kind of gives you an overall snapshot of the office. And I'll just buzz through it real quickly because it just gives you a high level idea of the scope and the breadth of the work that we do. So as you've heard, we have about 130 employees. We are the second largest district attorney's office in Oregon, the largest being in Multnomah County. And that makes sense because we are the second most populous county in Oregon. Every year in a normal year, and COVID is not normal, so there's an asterisk next to all of this with COVID, and I can talk to that in a moment. But annually, we serve roughly 12,500 crime victims, the vast majority of whom live and work and reside here in Washington County. We review about 11,800 criminal cases. That number does rise typically, and over the years it has risen consistently year to year. We file not every charge that comes to us gets filed. So in the roughly 11,800 cases we review, we choose to file charges in about 9,000 of those cases in a typical year. And the reasons for that can be complicated. Sometimes there's not enough evidence. Sometimes we make a judgment call about what we can and cannot proceed forward on. We try about 300 cases a year. That's what you see on TV normally, the law and order part of things in trials. And we do collect money for people. So we receive orders for what's called restitution. That's to compensate a crime victim for damage or for injuries of a little under $5.5 million annually. And we actually, something you may not think about too often, we go collect child support obligations that are owed for parents. So if one parent owes child support to another, annually we collect more than $35 million a year. And that's money in the pocket that we actually put in the pockets of the parents who are needing that money. I do want to talk to you a little bit about our specialty courts and treatment programs, just to remind you that we have these. And then at the end of this conversation, I'm happy to go back and do a deep dive on any one of these if any of you is interested. There's a lot on your screen, I know. And I'm not going to go into each one, but what I do want to tell you is that part of a modern 21st century approach to prosecution is to try not to be so reactive. If you think back to maybe 50 years ago, let's say, the DA's office was very reactive. A crime gets committed, the police make an arrest, the DA does the prosecution. And that still is the basic formula for what happens in a DA's office, but we've also realized that we can do more proactive work to try and change that equation from A to B to C. And part of our proactive approach is what are called specialty courts and treatment programs. And so what are those? Those are, there's a phrase people use commonly, it's called evidence-based, but those are proven techniques that have actually shown results where we can try and address root causes, the reason why some of this crime is occurring, and try and change the dynamic. So there are some things we can address and some things we cannot. And for example, greed. We can't really fix greed. Just naturally violent people, we can't really stop that. Sex crimes are very difficult to address because we're dealing with some complicated dynamics. But there are dynamics that we can address. And one of them, for example, is addiction. Very complicated dynamic, but we know there's a strong connection between people who have a drug addiction and people who commit property crimes. So if your identity is stolen, if your car is broken into, if your mail is stolen from your mailbox, there's a good chance that there might be some drug behavior at the root of that happening. I'm not taking away from the personal accountability and holding people responsible for their voluntary actions, even if they're motivated by an addiction. But what I'm saying is, in addition to prosecuting and holding someone accountable, we also look for ways to try and fix or address that underlying addiction so that that person is less likely to commit that crime or have the same motivations to commit those crimes down the road when they rejoin our community after they spend some time in jail or in the state prison. So these specialty courts are designed to try and address those types of dynamics. Addiction is one of them. Mental health is another one. Unaddressed trauma is another one. And for example, our Veterans Treatment Court has unaddressed trauma as a primary focus, where we try and help out service veterans who are dealing sometimes with trauma that's connected to their service, whether it's Vietnam or the Gulf or Afghanistan or anywhere in between. If we have a service veteran who has unaddressed trauma and there's criminality happening and there's a connection between those two things, we found our Veterans Treatment Court is a very successful way of trying to help that person out and keep our community safer. So that's an overall discussion of our specialty and treatment courts. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of our outreach efforts, and then I want to leave lots of time for questions as well. So don't worry, I won't just talk at you the whole time. But the next thing I do want to mention to you is, boy, 2020 and now 2021, there are so many challenges associated with it. But one perhaps positive has been a renewed focus on ensuring that we're being equitable in everything that we do in our justice system. And those of us who work in the justice system, many of us have been working on this long before the riots and the protests and all these issues that we've seen in the news. And a good example of that is something we've been doing here in Washington County called building bridges. And what you have in front of you is a snapshot from our most recent event that we put on last fall. Of course, it's on Zoom. It's the Brady Bunch box on the screen, just like you and I are on today. But building bridges is basically an effort to bring together governmental agencies like police and DAs and people in power and community members, not just the community groups, but also individual members, and to engage in greater dialogue to increase understanding. It's really that simple. And we've been doing it now for 5 years. We just had our 5th anniversary event this past fall. And having that framework already in place as we were dealing with some of the challenges from 2020 here in Washington County, but also region-wide, was just incredibly helpful. So I wanted just to reference that for you as something we have been doing and are continuing to do, and I'm happy to talk more to that as we continue with our conversation. I also wanted to share with you something that's new. It's actually happening next week that I'm really happy about. When I took over as DA 2.5, almost 3 years ago now, one of my priorities was to do everything I could to ensure that our prosecutors in our office as a whole, is as reflective of the community as we can be. And part of that is, wanting people who live and work in our community, because you've got skin in the game, so to speak, because you live here, like I do. Part of it also is making sure that we're reflective in all the other socio-demographic ways, making sure we're having a good mix of men and women, making sure we have a good mix of people with different life experiences, and a good mix of people who identify in different ways. So it's not all just one ethnic or one racial group. So part of that challenge has been, where do we find these people to work here? And what we realized is there's a real gap in Oregon when it comes to the law. And part of that gap is it's hard to recruit and to retain people who identify being members of diverse communities. So about 6 months ago, I was working with a group of members of the private bar and the public bar. So the bar is, of course, attorneys. And I was working with people in law firms and nonprofits and judges and the Oregon State Bar. And we were able to put together Oregon's first annual diversity legal professional job fair. And that's geared at hiring lawyers, but also paralegals and support staff. So not just people that have gone to law school. And it's a virtual event that's happening next week, March 9th and 10th. So we're very excited about that. And that doesn't just benefit my office, although it is a benefit, but it really benefits the entire legal community, which I think by extension benefits Washington County. So wanted to share that with you too, as something exciting that we're doing. And then the last thing I just want to touch on is an effort that I've been working on for a long time now. And like any difficult problem, it's something that just requires a lot of dedication to work through. But this effort is to really help out the most vulnerable victims. My own personal experience as a lawyer and as a prosecutor, before I was elected as the district attorney, I spent about 10 years prosecuting child abuse crimes, which are, in my opinion, the most vulnerable victims we have, the most innocent victims, the kids, and just the worst and most heinous crimes. Usually my friends would ask me, why in the world do you do that? And I would ask myself that question sometimes, but the reality is it's the most rewarding work I've ever done and probably ever will do. But I realized that there's a gap there too, which is I believe our county needs to do more for these kids. And an effort that we're working on is to bring a child abuse clinic that's currently located in Portland. It's called CARES Northwest, where we send kids who've experienced abuse and neglect, to bring them here into Washington County and to co-locate them with our relatively new domestic violence center called the Family Justice Center, because we know that there's a very high rate of abuse that happens to kids that's co-occurring, that's occurring alongside other domestic violence, usually to a spouse or to a loved one, or that kids who've been exposed to domestic violence need to have some trauma therapy and some rehabilitation. So I'm working with a good group of Washington County leaders throughout the community. And we're trying to bring together these two agencies to set something up here in Washington County that will help out our most vulnerable victims. So I wanted to share that with you. I'm just going to skip to my almost final slide now, and this is going to be my effort to spur conversation. There is no shortage of hot topics and controversial issues and interesting issues to discuss in criminal justice. It's basically the first 5 to 10 minutes of every evening news, every evening newscast, what's happening in our community. So I just, as I was sitting here thinking about my conversation with all of you today, I just put up there, some of the things that I thought you might be interested in hearing about. We don't have time to talk about each one of them, so I'm going to turn the microphone over to you for questions, but I'll read through them. Obviously, there's plenty to talk about with addiction and drugs. Oregon just had a groundbreaking, landmark, experimental vote in a new law called Ballot Measure 110 that effectively decriminalizes most user amounts of drug possession, things like meth, heroin, cocaine, etc. So we could talk about that. There's no shortage of issues with mental health and the interaction in the justice system. There's currently a conversation with the state legislature right now about whether to repeal a law called Measure 11, which is Oregon's violent crimes mandatory minimum law passed by the people back in the 1990s. We monitor closely crime rates, and I could tell you what's happening with violent crime and property crime rates statewide and in Washington County. Of course, equity and justice issues, we've touched on that. I'd be happy to discuss that further. What conversation these days would be complete without referencing COVID somehow? So if you have questions about how that's been working through the justice system, I'm happy to get to that. And frankly, anything else you'd like to talk about, I am more than happy to do. So I'm going to hit pause and see if people have questions, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see y'all.
Well, I had more of a comment than a question. I noticed what you were talking about, the child abuse, and about how people are, how the kids have got to be the worst, that take it the worst because they don't have the ability to really defend themselves. There was an article I read about a garbage collector who saw an Amber Alert, who stopped a pimp who was trying to pimp a girl. They caught him because of this. My point on that is everyone can be a member of the team that helps protect children.
That's absolutely correct. Not everyone will necessarily be in the position that garbage collector found himself in, but you are right. Part of that is, as parents, the first line of defense is talking to your kids and having that relationship with your kids, knowing what they're doing on the computer. Boy, that's the single biggest weakness that allows predators to access our children in our homes. It's the computers. And actually, our office, we put on an event to help educate parents about that. In fact, Stephen, I know, is listening. He can post a link. I think we have a video of that. It's a 1 hour or so video. If you're a parent and you're wondering, how do I keep my kids safe? This 1 hour video, actually, you'll find very, very helpful. So there's lots of tools that you can use to help address child abuse. I can't quite see everyone. I think, is it Tim? Do you have your hand up?
Yeah. In your time where you've been in the DA's office and with criminal justice, one of your questions here was, what about crime rates? Has the rate per 1,000 of violent crimes and or nonviolent crimes been increasing, decreasing, staying level?
Excellent question. It's almost like you were a plant for me. So thank you for asking that. Can you all see my screen? So ahead of our conversation, I went to a website. I'll post a link to this in the chat. Any one of you can go to it. It's the FBI. They have this really cool interactive website. And so what you see here is violent crime rates as tracked by the FBI in Oregon in blue, and in orange, and then in the United States in blue. And what you can see here, let me see, I've got one more version of this that might be more helpful for you. Here we go. Here's one that I edited to kind of explain some things. So if you look going from 1985, which is the first year that this particular website has the FBI data, and it's tracking what they call the Index 1 violent crimes. So these are the 4 or 5 most violent crimes, like rape, homicide, robbery, and I forget what the last 1 or 2 are. But it's tracking those violent crimes, and it's showing how the rate has changed over the years. Oregon's violent crime rate is sort of like one of those big ski jumps that goes down and then at the very end kind of curls back up again. So we had historic high levels of violent crime in the 1980s and frankly the 1970s. Oregon was, comparatively speaking, a very dangerous state when you look at violent crime rates, so rates per 100,000 people. A number of factors are at play, and it's actually very controversial right now what caused violent crime rates to drop? There are some who say that, violent crime rates dropped because the society was aging and baby boomers were essentially aging out of their crime years. Others say that there were other factors at play, and I believe there's other factors at play. Two significant factors at play were Oregon increased the ability to house dangerous criminals by increasing prison bed space. And also Oregon changed sentencing laws. And some key ways Oregon changed sentencing laws were, it used to be that the Board of Parole had a lot of control over how much time someone would spend in prison. So a judge could say, I'm sentencing you to 20 years in prison. And that's what everyone would hear in the courtroom. And then the Board of Parole would release them in 5 years, because the Board of Parole could essentially decide how much time would actually be served. That ended in 1989, that practice, and Oregon shifted to what's called a sentencing guideline practice, where the Board of Parole wouldn't have as much ability to undercut what the judge did. But then in 1994, the voters did something and they passed ballot measure 11. What measure 11 does is it says that there's a certain mandatory minimum for the most violent of violent crimes. So it's not all violent crimes, it's just the very upper level of violent crimes. So the forcible rape, not all rape, just the most dangerous and forcible type of rape. Sodomy, the most dangerous assaults, the kinds that leave people paralyzed, or the attempted murders. And that was in 1994. And then what you saw, frankly, is between 1995 and 2002, violent crime rates in Oregon dropped more than anywhere in the United States. And then they continued a steady relative decline over the next couple decades until you start getting to the mid teens here, so the last 5 to 7 years. And that's when you have that upward trend like a ski jump. The other factor that we know when it comes to crime rates in Oregon is that basically Multnomah County drives the ship. So yes, there are 36 counties, but some of these counties have fewer people than the city that I live in, Sherwood. So the number of people, the sheer volume of people and cases and crimes that are dealt with in Multnomah County is probably the single biggest factor in what happens to Oregon crime rates. And what we saw is that Multnomah County policy decisions in the mid-teens of the 2000s were such that there were lower sentences. And I can't say that that caused this increase in violent crime, but I can say that there has been an increase in violent crime that has been occurring over the last several years, especially over the last year. And we all, I think, read the same newspapers and see the same TV, so we see the same thing. But to answer the question about violent crime, that's what we're seeing. So if there's other questions, I can't see everyone at the same time on my screen. So feel free to go ahead and raise your hand, or just say a question, I guess.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I'm Jim Crisp. I have a question regarding Measure 11, which was passed by the people. And what about the victims? I just don't understand why they want to change what has been pretty successful. And I know you showed later on where it's kind of leveling out, but the population has increased considerably during that time too. So there's a lot more people in Oregon. And I imagine that has something to do with that. But I wonder about the victims.
That's a great question, sir. So first, the graph that I showed is crime rates per 100,000. So it takes into account population. And population of Oregon has significantly increased and changed over the last 20 years. When it comes to the crime victims, that is, as a prosecutor, that is how I see things. Because for me, when I hear a crime, whether it's assault or robbery or attempted murder, my mind immediately goes to the people that I've dealt with who have suffered that crime. And in our office, as you saw earlier, it's about over 12,000 a year, those crime victims that come in. they're the ones who are sitting in our lobby, and they often come to us, a few days or a couple of weeks removed from a traumatic incident happening, and then we work with them through the process. So when I think about the changes to our policies, I think first about what's the impact on the community. Second, what's the impact on the people who are directly affected by these crimes? One thing that Measure 11 does provide, in my opinion, is it gives the victims some sense of certainty about what to expect. So in the old way of doing things, remember, a victim would be in a courtroom and a judge might say, I'm sentencing you to X number of years, but that wouldn't be what would actually happen. And then there would be a very difficult process of the victim understanding exactly how much time will that person spend. I can't tell you how valuable it is in the current way when a judge under Measure 11 sentences someone. So for example, the mandatory minimum for the rape example I gave, a forcible rape at knife point, is 8.3 years. And 8.3 years means 8 years and 4 months, period. No time off for good behavior, no time off for early crowding, nothing like that. It's 8 years and 4 months. That matters to a victim, in my opinion, because they've had so much taken away from them, their sense of control over what occurs, their sense of self-worth, to give them something back, which is, you can count on this. And then often they'll do the math in their heads, especially on these child abuse cases, which are a large percentage of these cases. Usually the parents will think, okay, that means my daughter will be out of college, she'll be living on her own when he gets out, or that means my kids will be this old, or that means this will be happening in my life. And they plan for how their life will look because of that. So I think the victims have been overlooked in this process, frankly, and that's my biggest concern.
Thank you.
I had a question about that same graph. Obviously, Measure 11 is still in place, correct?
That's right.
However, the crime rate per thousand has been rising after falling to a minimum after a particular period of decline. And so is the quality of crime that's being committed that don't cast it into the Measure 11 category, are the number of those increasing, or what justifies the rise even with Measure 11 in place?
Yeah, that's a really good question that I probably won't have a single silver bullet, here's the answer for you. I think there are a number of factors at play. So one factor at play is, frankly, Multnomah County. So we have seen that there have been some changes in approach in Multnomah County, not just in the last year with the new DA, but over the past several years that I believe have an influence on what we're seeing with crime rates statewide. That's just one of many factors. Another factor, frankly, is as addiction and drug issues are out of control, frankly, as we're dealing with more and more heroin and meth issues that are out of control. There's a connection between drug use and not just property crime, but also violent crime. And that's also another factor in play. The other factor at play too, frankly, is jail and prison bed space. So for example, in Washington County, our jail at full capacity during a non-COVID time has 572 beds. And the reason that's important is a jail bed is the immediate place that a criminal goes once they've been arrested. And over the years, what we've seen is the population of people in that jail has gotten more and more dangerous. And what I mean by that is our jail is the second smallest per capita jail in the state here in Washington County. So it's a large jail. It's larger than many other counties' jails. But when you look at population and the size of the jail, and you compare that, we're the second smallest in the entire state. With COVID, that 572 bed number has been decreased to about 350 to 380, depending on the day and the circumstance, because they can't pack them in the way they used to do. And what we've noticed with that is now the only people going to jail are the really, really dangerous people, because the jail is having to let other people out. So for example, if you, let's say, commit an assault, a domestic violence assault, and you are that's a very dangerous type of crime. There's a high lethality associated with domestic violence crimes. It used to be the likelihood of you sitting in jail was much higher while you're waiting for your trial than it is currently. Those people tend to get released along with other types of criminals. And I believe that replicated around the state as different jails are not keeping pace with the population. I believe that's also a factor when we're looking at the rising crime rates. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, that helped. Because Multnomah County is apparently kind of swaying that graph some, are they simply not implementing Measure 11 the same?
Yeah, good question. And I want to start just by giving a little bit of a qualifier that I'm not a Multnomah County expert. I only can see what I see from my vantage point, which is the outside looking in. And there are good prosecutors in the Multnomah County DA's office and good people in law enforcement. But I can tell you that different DA's offices have different philosophies, and that's why the district attorney is an elected position. The DA in one county might emphasize things differently than the DA in another county. And I think that historically, Multnomah County's approach to these types of crimes has not been the same as, for example, the approach in Clackamas or Washington or Yamhill, the surrounding counties. And part of that has been to not advocate for, frankly, as long or lengthy sentences for certain violent crimes as occurs in some other counties. Is that what's driving this change? Is that why there's a ski jump at the end of that graph? I can't tell you that. I think it's probably one of many factors at play, and certainly not the only factor. I think there's probably other factors that are contributing to that as well.
Thank you very much.
You bet. So I'm on my list of hot topics. I'm trying to remember what else I had on there. I think COVID was one of them. Mental health and ballot measure 110, that's the drug legalization measure. Equity and justice issues. I'm happy to talk about any of those if you have questions.
How are the courts working now with COVID? Are they opening up more or not?
Yeah, really good question. So it's a tale of two cities in a couple of ways with the courts. So different counties, so every county has its own separate presiding judge and court system. So what's happening in Washington County is different than Multnomah County. And what's happening with the criminal cases is different than the civil cases. So often civil cases are overlooked, but they are very important cases. So not just a car crash, but businesses that need access to the court system, landlord-tenant issues, sometimes family law issues. Anyone that's gotten divorced or has child custody issues in the last 12 months has been very frustrated with the way things are going in the court system. So the courts have generally, they ground to a halt when COVID first hit in pretty much all areas. And then they slowly opened up to varying degrees in the criminal area, mostly because they had to, because we've got liberty interests and rights, and frankly, crime wasn't stopping. If anything, crime was changing and in some areas evolving and accelerating, but it wasn't stopping. So in the Washington County court system, after we ground to an immediate halt in March of last year, we opened it up again so that we continue to proceed forward with our what are called in custody cases. So if someone is sitting in jail accused of a crime, we generally are moving forward with that case. But then for many of our non-in custody cases, which are the vast majority of cases, those cases have been kind of slowed. My feeling on it is I think we should be doing more to open the courts up. I've always taken the approach that if Costco can do it, we can do it. If any of you have been to Costco in the last 6 months, you have noticed they've found a way to make it work. I think sometimes, and I say this as someone working within the government, I think sometimes the private sector, pardon the expression, but kicks our butt when it comes to thinking creatively and out of the box. And I think that we can take a lesson from the private sector, and we've tried to do that in the DA's office. So an example of that is we realized that we couldn't run court the same way we've been doing it. So we looked at, okay, can we do things differently? No one's using schools these days. Can we have a trial in a high school gymnasium? Why not? Why not put the judge at the free throw line and the attorneys at half court and the jury in the bleachers? Now, there's all sorts of practical reasons why that proved to be more challenging, but what we ended up doing, which I think is a pretty good example of creativity, Washington County had the misfortune of opening up a new convention center called the Wingspan over at the fairgrounds. And they opened up this convention center at the worst time ever to open up a convention center, which is in the middle of a pandemic. And so it was a brand new facility with ginormous rooms that nobody was using. So we worked with the county and we were able to use some federal CARES Act dollars to open up 2 courtrooms in basically these convention center ballroom size rooms where you can be in a courtroom with 30 people, but not be within 20 feet of anyone.
Paul?
Yeah.
And what we were able to do was we were able to take a number of our cases that have been backlogged. And we had about 1,200 cases, like a log jam that couldn't work their way through. And we cycled them through the court system and resolved about 3 out of every 4 of those cases. So that's kind of the story of one example of what's happening in the court system, but we're still facing a significant backlog.
Since the start of COVID, have the types of crimes changed dramatically?
Yes, good question. It's been interesting to see. So one dynamic that we noticed early on with COVID was that there's a difference between what gets reported and what's actually happening. Now, we've always known there's a difference between reported crime and actual crime. The best example I can give to you of that is car theft and bicycle theft. So car theft is one of the crimes that always gets reported. And do you know why? Anyone? It's because you can't get your insurance money to pay for your car if you don't file a police report. And cars cost a lot of money. So car theft almost always gets reported and almost always gets reported right away. So it's a very accurate indicator of reported numbers mirror the actual numbers. The opposite example of that is bike theft in Portland. If you look at the bike theft numbers in Portland, you would see that bike theft is probably not that big of a problem when it comes to reported bike theft. But does anyone know why reported bike theft is so low in Portland? It's because it happens so often and the police don't do anything about it. What's the bother in calling the police? Nothing will happen out of it. So there's an example where reporting a crime numbers are really deceptive. So taking that model forward with COVID, what we saw is the first week that schools shut down, child abuse reports dropped by half. And you might initially think that's a good thing because now we're dealing with 50% less child abuse. But the reality is the primary driver of reporting child abuse to police or to the DHS authorities is teachers. And the week schools shut down, teachers weren't there and they couldn't hear from the kids what was happening to them at home. And we know 2 ingredients of domestic violence and child abuse are social isolation and stress, which are basically, that's what 2020 was, social isolation and stress. So child abuse reports dropped by half, but we believe child abuse actual events has increased. And we're just now starting to see some of that. And we anticipate as schools reopen, we're going to see even more of that. Basically, we're going to see what we see every year in September when kids come back to school and tell their teachers who did what to them over the summer. We always see that. But we're going to see that times 1,000 with what happens after COVID. So that's a concern. Another concern is domestic violence reports initially dropped and then they spiked up as I believe our community was under stress. Commercial burglaries in Tigard in March and April increased by 300% as people were targeting businesses that were closed down, specifically in Tigard. Shoplifting in some areas dropped dramatically, like Washington Square Mall had no shoplifting because they shut them all down. So you see these differences in dynamics as COVID funnels crime in different areas. And I can tell you that we have a bit of a crime spree happening right now. In 2020, in Washington County, we had 5 murders. In 2021, so far, we've had 6 murders, and we're only 2 months into it. So we have surpassed our total number of homicides for all of last year right now in the first 2 months of 2021. And I think people are getting to be at a breaking point, and we're dealing with a lot of other kind of dynamics that are influencing crime. So those are some concerns between reported crime and actual crime and the impact of COVID.
That's great. Well, thank you, Kevin. And I know we could ask questions all day, but unfortunately, I think we're kind of at the end of our time. But we really appreciate you being here. And also thank you to Stephen Mayer for being here. If you click on